Opening narrative, on boy, effectivement key too. In the dusty back roads of Ironwood Hollow, a broke young man was handed a half-dead Mustang as a joke, a cruel reminder of everything he'd never be. The townsfolk laughed. The rich called it charity. But when Luke Carter placed a hand on that old stallion's neck, something ancient stirred. What followed wasn't just a race, it was redemption, rebellion, and a memory no one could bury. The spring wind rolled down from the ironwood ridge like a restless spirit, stirring dust devils in the empty lots and carrying the scent of hay, old leather, and pine. In the heart of Ironwood Hollow, a Wyoming town so small it didn't show up on half the maps, folks were gathering at the county fairgrounds for what passed around here as a big event, the annual Spring Derby and Community Market. It wasn't a professional race, not even close. More of a tradition wrapped in local pride, where ranchers let their sons or grandsons ride the family horses around a barrel track for bragging rights and the chance to say their bloodline still had some fire in it. The prize was a silver belt buckle and a gift certificate to the feed store. But the real currency was respect. And for someone like Luke Carter, that was more valuable than any paycheck. Luke stood at the edge of the dusty auction pen, hands deep in the pockets of his threadbare jeans. 22 years old, tall but lean like a fence post, he had the kind of face that carried both youth and tiredness, skin sun-worn from working outside, eyes full of questions that life hadn't gotten around to answering. He wasn't supposed to be here, not really. "Luke," his mother had said that morning, pressing a tin lunchbox into his hand, "I know you love horses, but don't you go letting them folks laugh you out of your own skin. You hear me?" He'd nodded, kissed her on the cheek, and walked out the door anyway. Martha Carter had raised him alone after his father died in a mill accident when Luke was just 8. She worked long hours at the Ironwood laundry, starching other people's shirts so she and her boy could eat. They lived on the outskirts of town in a rundown trailer backed up against a dry field where the wind never stopped, and the fence had more holes than wood. Luke worked part-time at Mason's Feed and Grain, shoveling oats and stacking bales. He'd never owned a horse, never had the money to even rent one, but he'd spent every spare moment watching them at the races, the stables, the fields. He read books on training, watched old rodeo reels until the tape wore thin. The boy didn't just dream about horses, he breathed them. But in Ironwood Hollow, dreams didn't count for much. And that's why, when Gordon Munro walked up to him that afternoon with a smug grin stretched across his face, Luke braced himself. Gordon was the kind of man who wore his power like a second skin. Thick-set, tanned, always in polished boots and a pearl-button shirt, even when he wasn't going anywhere. He owned Munro Stables, the biggest horse ranch for 50 miles, and didn't let anyone forget it. He was also the self-appointed king of the Spring Derby, having sponsored the race for over a decade. Standing beside him, holding a loose lead rope, was a boy no older than 17, probably one of Munro's hired hands. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the kid, it was the horse, if you could call it that. The animal looked like it had been scraped out of a storm drain. Pale gray coat, matted and dull, ribs showing like slats through paper skin. The hind leg bore a faded scar, and the ankle trembled with each uneven step. Its head hung low, ears twitching at the sound of laughter echoing from the small crowd forming nearby. Gordon's voice cut through the chatter like a branding iron. "Well, Carter, I heard you've been sniffing around the race circuit again, telling folks you might sign up this year." Luke stayed quiet. He knew better than to rise to the bait. Gordon grinned wider. "I figured I'd help you out. Thought I'd donate a mount, seeing as you're a little short in the ownership department." He snapped his fingers, and the kid led the horse forward. "This here's yours. Now, consider it a gift. Now you can't say you were left out on account of being horseless." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Luke heard someone mutter, Guess it's true beggars can be choosers. He stared at the creature in front of him. The horse lifted its head, just barely, and for a split second their eyes met. There was something there. Not fear, not defiance either. Something else. Something hollow and old, like a lantern that once burned hot, but now only held smoke. Gordon clapped Luke on the shoulder, hard. Go on, take it. Let's see how far that thing gets past the start line. Luke nodded once. He reached out and gently took the lead rope from the stable hand. As soon as his hand brushed the horse's neck, the animal stiffened. Then it let out a quiet breath, leaned slightly into his touch, as if it recognized something no one else could see. "Got yourself a real winner, Carter," someone jeered. But Luke didn't hear them anymore. The world shrank down to just him and the horse. "What's your name?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. "What did they call you before they threw you away?" The horse blinked. Luke felt the tremble in the rope between them. "I'll call you Shadow for now," he said, "till we remember who you were." He led the horse through the crowd, past the stables, and down toward the road that led back to his mother's land. The laughter faded behind him, but the weight of it clung to his shoulders. As they walked, he spoke softly, like to an old friend. "I don't know what they did to you, or why they think you're done," Luke murmured, "but I ain't afraid of a broken thing." The horse gave no answer, only followed him step by step, its uneven gait echoing on the cracked pavement like the start of something neither of them could name. Far behind them, Gordon Munro watched with narrowed eyes. Ellie, his daughter, stood at a distance near the paddock rail. She hadn't laughed, hadn't even smiled. Her hand was clenched around the old locket she wore, eyes locked not on Luke, but on the horse. That scar on its hind leg, that streak of silver in its mane. She knew that horse, and she knew her father had just made the worst mistake of his life. The trail back to the Carter property wasn't much more than a tire-worn path edged with tumbleweeds and brittle fence posts. The late spring sky turned a dusty blue, streaked with orange as the sun dipped behind the low hills that guarded the edges of Ironwood Hollow. Luke kept his pace slow, matching the staggered rhythm of the pale Mustang limping beside him. "Shadow," he called him, "at least for now." The horse hadn't made a sound since they left the fairgrounds. No whinny, no snort, not even a tired grunt. Just that limping shuffle and the occasional flick of an ear, as though he were still unsure whether Luke was a friend or just another hand holding a rope. Luke glanced over at him. "I know it don't look like much," he said, motioning toward the patch of earth up ahead that barely passed for a homestead. "But it's quiet, and the water trough don't freeze over in spring." Their place sat on a rented acre of land behind the old railroad line where rusted boxcars had once rattled through before the station closed in the 90s. The Carter trailer leaned slightly southward, like it had grown tired of standing up straight. The backfield was fenced in with barbed wire, that hadn't seen a repair in 10 years, and the old tack shed still bore the bullet holes from some teenager's BB gun phase. Behind it all, like a loyal sentinel, stood the skeletal frame of what used to be a horse shelter. 2 rotted posts and a splintered crossbeam that once held a rusted roof. Luke led Shadow to the center of the field, where patches of half-dead grass clung to the dirt like stubborn hope. "Sorry we don't have a proper stall," Luke muttered as he unfastened the lead rope. "But it's yours, if you want it." Shadow didn't move. He stood there, head low, chest rising and falling slow but steady. His right hind leg quivered beneath him, but he didn't sit, didn't rest. It was like he was holding himself together out of sheer will. "Luke Alexander Carter!" came a sharp voice from the porch. His mother's silhouette stood in the screen door, hands on hips, a towel still over her shoulder from folding linens. Martha Carter was not a tall woman, but she stood like a tree in a windstorm, rooted and unshakable. Her apron bore fresh laundry powder smudges, and her gray-streaked hair was pulled tight behind her head. Luke winced. "Hey, Mama, you brought home a horse," she said flatly. "You brought home a crippled horse." "It's more complicated than that. Complicated is when your check bounces. This is just insane." She stepped down off the porch, squinting at the animal. Her face softened just a hair as she took in the creature's ribs, the sores near the withers, the haunted look in its eyes. "Good Lord," she whispered. "That ain't no horse. That's a ghost with a heartbeat. He's not just bones, Mama. He's got fight in him. I can feel it." "You can't feed a feeling, Luke." She crossed the yard, resting her hand lightly on the Mustang's neck. To her surprise, he didn't flinch, just breathed slow, steady. "Well," she said after a beat, "if we're keeping this mess, you had told him this a mess. You'd better start with some warm mash and that salve I keep under the sink." Luke grinned. She didn't smile back. "Don't you think this means I approve?" He already had a bucket in his hands. That night, Luke sat cross-legged just outside the trailer's back door, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Shadow stood under the half-collapsed shelter, nosing around a fresh pile of hay with mild interest. Luke had brushed out what tangles he could, clipped the cracked hooves with a rusted trimmer he'd borrowed from Old Man Mason, and even managed to wash off most of the dirt with a garden hose. "Your coat's silver under all that," Luke murmured as he scribbled something in a battered notebook. "Bet you used to shine under the lights." He talked for an hour, maybe more, about his dad, about the dreams he'd buried in the back of his closet, about the years of being told, "No, not yet, not you." Shadow didn't move much, but he didn't walk away either. Then came the knock. 3 short taps on the screen door, and then a slow creak as it opened. Amos Whitfield stepped inside like the cold wind had brought him there. "Martha," he said with a tip of his dusty hat. "Luke." "Evenin', Amos," Martha replied cautiously. Amos was 74 years old, built like a retired fence post, weathered, slightly bowed, but unbroken. He'd ridden bulls in his prime, trained Mustangs for rodeos all across Colorado and northern Utah, and outlived 2 wives and 4 dogs. He lived alone in a little green trailer on the edge of town, smoked cigars that smelled like old books, and could spot a lame horse by the way it blinked. "I heard a whisper," he said, stepping closer to the screen, "that Gordon Monroe gave you a gift." Luke chuckled dryly. "That's one way to put it. I come to see it with my own eyes. Mind if I take a look?" Luke nodded. "He's out back." They walked together through the yard. Amos moved slow, but with purpose, as if each step was a deliberate promise. When he laid eyes on Shadow, he stopped cold. The Mustang lifted his head. Just a little. "Enough." Amos muttered a word that might have been a prayer. He walked a slow circle around the horse, noting the dip of the spine, the twisted scar above the fetlock, the faint star-shaped marking near the throat latch. Then he knelt wincing as old joints cracked and placed a hand on the withered leg. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed. "It is him." Luke blinked. "Who?" Amos looked up, voice low. "They used to call him Silver Ghost. 10 years back, he was the fastest Mustang in 3 counties. Belonged to a woman named Lydia Monroe, Ellie's mama. That horse won every race he entered. Never needed a whip, just pointed him and let him fly." Luke's heart thumped. Then what happened? Lydia passed. Rumor said the old man couldn't stand the sight of the horse afterward. Folks assumed he'd sold him off or put him down. But looks like he just buried him in shame. Luke stared at the horse anew. "You think he remembers?" Amos stood slowly. "Horses don't forget, son. They just stop showing it." That night, long after Amos left and his mama had gone to bed, Luke sat in the dirt with the old Mustang's breath warming the cold air between them. "You're not a joke," he whispered. "You're not broken. You're just waiting." The horse dipped his head low, touched Luke's shoulder with his muzzle, and exhaled a breath so slow it almost sounded like a sigh. The mornings came softer now, not because the wind had stopped whipping through the slats of the Carter fence, or because the sun rose any later over Ironwood Hollow, but because something had shifted in the rhythm of the place. It began with the sound of hooves scraping gently in the dirt and a soft whicker from the makeshift corral behind the trailer. Shadow had started greeting Luke at sunrise, as if the old Mustang had finally decided the boy was worth his time. Luke woke with the birds, slipping out of bed with a grunt as the cold floor bit through his socks. He pulled on his flannel and denim jacket, still damp from yesterday's hose bath, grabbed the satchel of homemade poultices Amos had given him, and stepped outside. The Mustang stood in the pale light, watching him. Just watching. "I brought the good stuff today," Luke said as he reached the fence, holding up the brown glass jar like a sacred offering. "Yarrow and goldenrod. Old man Whitfield says it's what the mountain tribes used on busted legs." Shadow didn't flinch when Luke crossed the threshold of the corral. That alone felt like progress. Luke knelt beside the bad leg, carefully peeling back the wrapping from the night before. The swelling had gone down a touch, and the crusted wounds now looked more like stories than injuries. "You ever been to the top of Calico Ridge?" Luke asked as he smeared the salve gently along the tendon. "My dad used to take me up there when I was little. Said the wind up there could blow the anger out of a man." He kept talking low and even. About the ridge, about his dad, about the time he accidentally kicked a copperhead in the woodpile and ran screaming like a city girl. Through it all, Shadow remained still, save for the occasional flick of his ear or the soft twitch of muscle beneath Luke's fingers. It was the first time the ranch felt like home in months. Later that day, Amos arrived in his battered Ford truck, dragging behind it a wooden training post he'd pulled from his own back pasture. Luke helped him set it up, hammering in braces until the thing stood firm in the middle of the corral. "You sure he's ready for this?" Luke asked, glancing at Shadow. "Son," Amos replied, tossing a loop of rope over his shoulder, "that horse has seen more sunrises than you've seen breakfast. He knows what to do. The question is, do you?" They worked until dusk's slow introductions to touch, lead, pressure. Amos never raised his voice, never rushed. "It's not about making him obey," he said. "It's about making him trust." That night, Luke stayed out long after his mama called him in for dinner. He sat on the ground, legs stretched out, Shadow dozing nearby. The moon hung low and fat above the ridge, spilling silver over the field. "You don't have to run," Luke whispered. "Not today, maybe not ever. But if you ever feel it in your bones again, feel the fire, I'll be right beside you." The next evening, it was Ellie Monroe who came. She didn't knock, didn't call out, just appeared near the back fence like a ghost in denim and sorrow, holding a canvas bag in one hand and wiping her eyes with the other. Luke spotted her from the corral and approached slowly. "Evenin'," he said, unsure if it was welcome. She looked up, her cheeks streaked with drying tears. "I heard rumors about the horse." "He's here," Luke said softly. "You know him?" Ellie nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "His name was Ghost, my mom's horse. She raised him from a foal, trained him herself. He was different, smarter than the rest. He didn't just run, he listened." Luke opened the gate and stepped aside. She didn't hesitate. The moment Ellie stepped into the corral, Ghost lifted his head. The look that passed between them was something ancient, something sacred. Her breath caught. She dropped the bag and stumbled forward, both hands covering her mouth, as the old Mustang took a step toward her. "Oh, my God," she whispered. "It is him." She reached out, trembling, and placed her hand on his cheek. The horse leaned into it. "I thought he was dead," she said, tears spilling now. "After Mom passed, I begged my father not to sell him. He told me he'd found him a home. That was a lie, wasn't it?" Luke nodded slowly. "He gave him to me at the auction. Called it a joke." Ellie closed her eyes. "That sounds like him." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then she bent down, opened the bag, and pulled out a bottle of liquid vitamins, a tin of coat balm, and a handful of dried apples. "My mom kept a journal," Ellie said, her voice steadier now. "She used to say Ghost was more than a horse. He was a soul in a borrowed body. She believed if he ever found the right person, he'd run again. Not for money, not for pride, just for the joy of it." Luke swallowed the lump in his throat. "I don't know if I'm that person." Ellie smiled, sad but sincere. "I think maybe he already decided you are." Over the next few days, Ellie came often. She didn't say much at first, just watched from the fence or brought small gifts. Liniment, old photos, stories of Ghost as a young colt running through the fields behind their ranch. But slowly the fence between her and Luke began to fall away. They talked late into the evenings. She told him about her mother's slow illness, the way the Monroe estate had changed after she died, how her father had grown colder, crueler. "He hates reminders," Ellie said one night. "Ghost was her shadow. Seeing him, I think it broke something in him." Luke told her about his father, about the accident that took him, about the emptiness it left in the house and in Martha's eyes. He shared things he'd never said aloud. And Ellie listened, really listened. One evening, as the three of them stood in the last light of dusk, boy, girl, and horse, Ellie turned to Luke and said, "If you keep caring for him, I'll help you get him back on his feet. I still remember some of Mom's techniques. She used acupressure, herbs, even music." Luke nodded. "I don't care if he runs. I just want him to stand tall again. I want people to see him." Ellie smiled. "Then we'll do it together." That night, after she left, Luke knelt in the dirt beside Ghost and placed his hand over the old scar near the withers. "I won't let them laugh at you again," he whispered. "That's a promise." The Mustang shifted his weight, leaned in, and for the first time let out a soft nicker low, warm and steady. It sounded like trust. The whisper of spring turned sharper in Ironwood Hollow. Cold wind rattled the tin roof of the Carter trailer, shaking loose the leaves that had clung to the gutters through winter. But inside Luke, something was warming a purpose, a pulse that felt like it had been missing for years. And it all centered around one battered Mustang with storm-colored eyes. Word spread faster than wildfire. It started with hushed murmurs at Buckley's feed store. Then it took a full gallop down to the diner, spilled over into Sunday sermon, and by Monday afternoon, every tongue in town was clucking about Luke Carter and the half-dead Mustang that was somehow still standing. "He's going to race that thing?" snorted Barry at the gas station. "That nag couldn't trot a straight line if it had a GPS strapped to its butt." "They're just bored," Luke told Ellie, as they sat on two overturned buckets outside the pen. "They need a laugh." Ellie tilted her head. "Then let them laugh, but they'll still have to watch." Shadow No Ghost now nuzzled her hand as she offered a slice of dried apple. The training was slow, painfully slow. Ghost's gait was still uneven, especially on hard ground. But on the soft trail up behind the Carter place, where the grass grew in springy tufts and the wind blew clean, he moved like a dream caught between this world and the next. Amos came by every afternoon, leaning on the fence like a weathered statue, offering small corrections, but mostly silence. He watched with the wary patience of someone who had seen too many hopefuls burn out under the weight of their own dreams. One Tuesday evening, as dusk painted the sky in burnt orange, Amos spit into the dirt and said, "That horse is trying, and that says more than any blue ribbon." Luke wiped sweat from his brow. He's got the heart. I just hope that's enough. It wasn't just training that occupied their time now. Martha, ever skeptical, had started leaving sandwiches wrapped in wax paper near the fence post. One morning, Luke found a folded $20 bill tucked beneath a jar of liniment and a note in her scratchy handwriting, for oats, or for gas to leave this town and never look back. He smiled and kept the note in his wallet, but not everyone was so subtle. One afternoon, Luke returned from a run to town and found a folded envelope pinned to the trailer door with a rusty nail. Inside was a cashier's check for $500 and a note, "Walk away before you fall harder than the horse does." "Who gave you this?" Martha asked, storming out with the envelope clutched in her hand. Luke shrugged. "Doesn't say." Martha narrowed her eyes. "It smells like Monroe." And she was right. 2 days later, Gordon Monroe rolled up in a black Silverado with chrome rims and a license plate that read, "Win Big." He stepped out in a pearl snap shirt too clean for ranch work, boots too polished for dirt, and that ever-present smirk curling his lips. "Afternoon, Martha," he said, like they were neighbors sharing pie. "Not bad blood." Martha didn't answer. Gordon turned to Luke. "Son, you've made your point. You've milked this little redemption tale for all it's worth. People are talking. Some are even betting. You should be proud." Luke stood silent. "You're going to embarrass yourself," Gordon continued. "That horse isn't what he used to be. And you're certainly not what anyone expected." Ellie stepped out from behind the corral, her eyes sharp. "Then why are you here, Dad?" Gordon's smile faltered for just a breath. "Because I'm trying to save you from more disappointment." "You mean from the truth?" she fired back. Gordon's face darkened. "You keep siding with them, young lady, and you'll find yourself without a roof or a last name." Ellie pulled out her phone, tapped the screen. "You just said that on record." He stared at her, silent, cold. Then he turned, climbed back in his truck, and peeled off down the road, tires spitting gravel like curses. That night, Luke sat with Ghost under the stars, bandaging his leg, hand steady despite the storm in his chest. "He's afraid," Ellie said quietly. "Of what?" "That someone like you might actually matter. That this horse, this joke, might become a symbol he can't control." Luke looked down at the old Mustang. "I'm not trying to win. I'm just trying to finish." Ellie smiled. "That's why you might win." The days crawled toward race day. At every corner of town, someone seemed to have an opinion. Some placed bets 10-1 against Luke. Some jeered. Some, quietly, began to hope. Luke turned down 3 offers of cash to withdraw. The last one came from a man in a pressed suit who claimed to be representing an interested party. Luke offered him a balled-up sandwich wrapper in return, but nothing unsettled him more than the night Ghost stumbled. They were doing figure 8s, ou boites, in the clearing behind the house. The wind was high, the air heavy. Ghost turned too sharply on a loose patch of gravel. His leg buckled. For one horrible moment, Luke thought it was all over. But Ghost didn't go down. He caught himself, staggered, snorted, and then stood still, his sides heaving, his eyes locked on Luke's. "I got you," Luke whispered, wrapping his arms around the Mustang's neck. "You don't fall alone. Not anymore." The next morning, Ellie showed up with a letter. A yellowed envelope, faded ink. Her mother's handwriting. "She wrote this for whoever ended up with Ghost," Ellie said, her voice shaking. "I wasn't ready to read it before. I think maybe now I am." They opened it together. "To the one who finds him, he is not broken. He is not angry. He is simply waiting. This horse runs not for ribbons, not for glory. He runs for love, for the sound of a voice that believes in him, for the weight of a hand that knows when to hold on and when to let go. If you listen, truly listen, he will carry you farther than you ever dreamed, And if you love him, he will never stop running. Signed, Joanna Monroe. Luke folded the letter and placed it in the saddlebag. The next few days blurred into final preparations. Amos replaced the old bit with a lighter one. Ellie braided a red ribbon into Ghost's mane, just like her mother used to. Martha packed a thermos of coffee and a tin of cornbread for race day. And Luke, every night, whispered the same thing into Ghost's ear before sleep. Not for them, not even for me, just because you can. When the sun rose over Ironwood Hollow, the morning of the race, the wind was still. The sky was clear, and Ghost stood at the edge of the pasture, head held high, the scars on his leg visible in the light. But no longer defining him. Not a has-been, not a joke, but a horse who remembered how to believe. The night before the race came quiet and slow, like the calm breath before a storm. A light drizzle had begun to fall across Ironwood Hollow, soft enough to hush the earth, but steady enough to keep the air full of memory. Luke stood inside the lean-to barn, brushing the dust from Ghost's coat. His fingers moved gently, slow and deliberate, not out of caution, but reverence. Every stroke seemed to calm the air between them, like a ritual passed down from souls older than this town. Ghost stood still, breathing in rhythm with Luke. The bandage on his leg had been removed that morning. In its place, Amos had tied a strip of soft leather, soaked in arnica oil, and wrapped tight with confidence instead of tape. "Looks more like a soldier than a racer," Amos had said, running a knobby hand down Ghost's flank. "But sometimes the best fighters don't wear medals." Luke looked Ghost in the eye and whispered, "We ain't got medals, but we got stories." That night the town was asleep, or at least pretending to be. But headlights rolled in slow down the dirt road near the Carter trailer. It was Ellie. She stepped out of her truck with a bundle in her arms, a sealed envelope, a tin canister, and a small velvet pouch. Her boots splashed in the mud as she crossed to the barn. Luke met her in the glow of a hanging lantern. "You shouldn't be here," he said. She smiled softly. "Neither should you, but here we are." She held out the envelope. It was yellowed with time. The edges were curled, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Joanna Monroe. She wrote 2 letters, Ellie said, one for the person who'd care for Ghost, and one for the night before he was supposed to race again. Luke took the envelope, held it to his chest for a moment, then opened it slowly. "If you're reading this, then he's found someone brave enough to believe in him. That's all he ever needed. The world sees race day as a finish line. But it's not. It's a gate. What matters is not how fast you cross it, but whether you dared to run at all. Take him to that gate and let him decide. If he wants to run, he will. If he wants to walk, then walk beside him. And if he chooses to stand still, hold his head high and let him stand with pride. Because the truth is, he's already won. You both have." Signed, Joanna. Luke's throat tightened. He folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the saddlebag hanging on the wall. "She knew him better than anyone," he said. "She loved him like family," Ellie replied, eyes shining with unshed tears. "And tomorrow the whole town's going to learn what it means to be loyal." She handed him the tin. Inside were herbs, fennel, goldenrod, willow bark crushed into powder and mixed with beeswax. "Mom's old blend," Ellie explained. "You rub it on the leg before the race. Helps with circulation, and it's what she used during his prime." Luke nodded, deeply moved. Finally she pulled out the velvet pouch. From inside she withdrew a ribbon-red satin, slightly frayed at the edges, but clean and strong. "She used to braid this into his mane," Ellie said, her voice cracking. "Said it gave him courage." Luke took it gently, then met her eyes. "Will you stay with us tonight? I thought you'd never ask." They sat together beside Ghost, who lay down in the straw between them like a great ship anchored for the night. The rain tapped steadily on the tin roof above. Ellie leaned against Luke's shoulder. He spoke softly into the stillness. "When I was a kid," Luke began, "I'd come home from school and sit on the back steps. I'd imagine a horse gray, wild, powerful, just standing at the end of the road, waiting for me. I never told anyone, not even Mom. But he was always there, in my mind." Ellie turned her face toward his. "And now?" He smiled. "Now he's real." At some point in the night, Luke dozed off, head resting against Ghost's side. He dreamt of thunder, of hooves slicing through fog, and a distant tree on a hilltop where someone stood, arms wide, calling him forward. When he woke, dawn was breaking. The rain had stopped. The world outside was wrapped in mist, but the sun was beginning to push through. He stood up, stretched, and walked out to the open field behind the barn. And there it was. The old gate. It wasn't a literal gate, just two leaning fence posts, half covered in vines, with nothing strung between them. It had once marked the entrance to the riding trail his grandfather had used. Now it stood like a forgotten monument, silent, crooked, still. Luke walked back inside, saddled Ghost without a word. No bit. Just a halter and a lead rope. He led the horse out into the fog, barefoot on the wet grass, the air electric with promise. Ellie and Martha stood on the porch, arms wrapped around steaming mugs, watching. Luke stopped a few feet from the gate. Ghost shifted his weight, ears flicking forward. "This is it," Luke said softly. "If you want to turn back, I'll walk with you. If you want to go forward, I'll follow." He dropped the lead rope. Ghost stood still for a long moment. Then he took a step. And another. He passed between the posts with his head held high. No rush, no fear, just dignity. Luke followed behind, blinking back tears. He mounted bareback a few yards later, and the two of them rode into the woods like a ghost and a boy who once had dreams, but now had something better. They weren't practicing anymore. They were remembering. Every turn in the trail felt familiar to Ghost. He moved with fluid strength. Not fast, but right. By the time they returned, the mist had lifted, and so had the last doubts. Luke looked over at Amos, who had arrived sometime during the ride and now stood near the fence. "You think he's ready?" Luke asked. Amos chuckled. "Son, I think you're ready. He's just been waiting on you." Luke dismounted, pressed his forehead to Ghost's. "I'll see you at the starting line, partner." And for the first time, Ghost let out a soft nicker, not wild, not loud, just enough for Luke to know. He'd heard him. The sky over Ironwood Hollow was the kind of blue that looked painted too perfect, too still, like the world was holding its breath. Dew clung to every blade of grass in the open field behind the fairgrounds, and the scent of warm hay, coffee, and saddle oil drifted through the morning air. By 8 a.m., the crowd was already gathering. Trucks lined the outer fence like steel monuments, and kids ran between hay bales while their parents clustered near the bleachers with thermoses in hand. The Ironwood Annual Derby wasn't just a race, it was a ritual. Old-timers in pressed Wranglers passed judgment on everything from hoof size to hat shape. Local vendors hawked deep-fried biscuits and rattlesnake jerky. And tucked at the far end of the track, near the old announcer's booth that still smelled of tobacco and paint thinner, stood the 5 racers. Luke Carter was the last to arrive. He wore the only jeans he owned that didn't have holes in them, a flannel shirt that Martha had ironed with trembling hands, and a pair of scuffed boots that once belonged to his grandfather. He led Ghost by the reins, walking slow, letting the crowd take it all in. The whispers started immediately. Is that the Monroe Mustang? Can't be. That thing's held together with duct tape and prayer. They're just here for the sympathy vote. Ghost didn't flinch. Neither did Luke. They walked with a quiet rhythm, like they had a promise to keep, and didn't care who was watching. From the announcer's booth, a voice crackled through the ancient PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 75th Annual Ironwood Hollow Spring Derby. 5 racers this year, including one surprise entrant. There were chuckles, then full-on laughter. From the stands, Gordon Monroe leaned back in his VIP seat, arms crossed, jaw tight. Ellie sat a few rows behind him, sunglasses on, hands clenched in her lap. Amos Whitfield stood near the rail, hat low, eyes narrowed. Then came the starting bell. The racers mounted. Ghost stood calm as Luke climbed into the saddle, gripping the reins loosely. No spurs, no bit, just trust. To their left, Weston Phelps adjusted his goggles like a man who'd already spent the prize money. His horse, a chestnut quarter horse named Dagger, snorted, hooves pounding with nervous energy. On Luke's other side, Tamara Bell. The reigning local champion nodded politely. "Good luck," she said. Luke nodded back. "You too." The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2. The gate dropped. The horses burst forward like a thunderclap. For the first few seconds, Luke was right there with them. Ghost's legs found rhythm on instinct, hooves striking the packed dirt like drumbeats from another life. His ears pinned forward, mane flying, muscles coiling beneath Luke like coiled springs. They rounded the first bend, still in 4th place. Luke leaned forward, whispering, "Steady, partner. Run your race." The second curve came up fast, a downhill stretch, flanked by cottonwoods. Dagger surged ahead, cutting off Tamara, who shouted something unprintable. The crowd roared. And then came the hill. It wasn't a steep incline, but to a horse with an old wound, it might as well have been Everest. Ghost stumbled just slightly, his back right leg faltering for a heartbeat. Luke felt it in his spine. He loosened the reins, shifted his weight. "It's okay," he murmured. "We can stop right here." Ghost hesitated. The others thundered past. For a moment, Luke thought it was over. But then Ghost lifted his head and saw it. At the top of the hill stood the old oak tree. The same one where Joanna Monroe used to stand, back when Ghost was just a silver flash in the wind, back when she'd braid ribbons into his mane and hum lullabies from the saddle. Ghost stared at that tree like it had spoken to him, and maybe it had. Because in the next breath he pushed forward, not with speed, but with purpose. His stride steadied, his head rose, the limp in his leg vanished, not because it healed, but because it didn't matter anymore. He remembered who he was. Luke didn't kick or shout. He just held on, whispering prayers in disbelief. They crested the hill. The crowd gasped. Ghost picked up speed on the decline. One by one, they passed horses that had thought they left him in the dust. Tamara saw them coming and shook her head, almost smiling. By the final stretch, the home straight, there were only 2 horses ahead, Dagger and a paint gelding named Smokes. The finish line shimmered in the morning haze like a mirage. Luke whispered, "You don't have to win. You've already made them believe." But Ghost had other plans. With a final surge, he moved like lightning wrapped in skin. Not flawless, not even fast by professional standards, but free. And free was all he ever needed to be. The crowd rose to its feet. Some clapped, some wept, some simply stared. Gordon Monroe stood stone-faced, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Ellie stood too, hands over her heart, tears rolling silently. The announcer fumbled the microphone as the horses crossed the finish. It was close, too close to call, but when the final time was posted, silence fell over the field. First place, Luke Carter and Ghost. The roar that followed wasn't just for victory. It was for redemption, for legacy, for a boy and a horse they all laughed at. Luke dismounted slowly. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he kept one hand on Ghost's neck, grounding them both. Reporters surged forward. Kids shouted his name. Ellie ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He looked down at Ghost, whose sides heaved with exhaustion, but whose eyes burned bright. "You did it," Luke whispered. "You didn't run for them. You ran for you." Ghost lowered his head. A soft nicker trembled from his throat. Amos came forward, tipping his hat. "Son," he said, "that was the finest ride I've seen since 1973, and back then I was still sober." Laughter rippled. The mayor tried to speak. The prize was announced. Someone handed Luke a ribbon. Someone else offered a check. But none of it mattered, because Ghost had won the only race that counted. He'd come back. The summer that followed was the warmest Ironwood Hollow had seen in nearly a decade. The wind no longer carried the dry bite of indifference, but something gentler like forgiveness, like change. The race was over, but the story, the real story, had just begun. Gordon Monroe showed up at the Carter doorstep 3 days later, not in a truck, not with a lawyer. He came on foot, hat in hand, with boots that hadn't touched this side of town in 20 years. Luke opened the door before he knocked. The two men stared at each other, one young, weathered by circumstance, the other older, weathered by choice. "I came to apologize," Gordon said, "not just for the horse, for all of it." Luke didn't say a word, but he stepped aside. Inside, Gordon sat stiffly in the same kitchen chair Martha Carter had repaired with wire and prayer more times than she could count. He looked smaller here, human. "I gave you Ghost to humiliate you," he said, "because I saw a boy with nothing but pride, and I thought that was dangerous. Turns out I was right. But not in the way I feared." Martha poured 2 cups of tea, one for Luke, one for Gordon. Hers stayed in her hand. "She forgave you before you got here," Luke said, nodding toward his mother. "I didn't ask her to," Gordon replied. "No," Martha said quietly, "but I did it anyway." Gordon looked down. "I'd like to make it right." Ellie walked in just then. No makeup, no guarded smile, just her and her truth. "Then start by giving me what's mine," she said. "Give me the old Monroe barn." He flinched. "It's condemned, barely standing. Then it won't cost you much to sign it over." That was how the Mustang revival program began. It started with Ellie Monroe and Luke Carter standing in the middle of that decaying barn with a stack of lumber, 3 shovels, and a Mustang, who still walked like royalty even when surrounded by sawdust. They rebuilt the stalls first wider, warmer, safer. No chains, no concrete, just wood, hay, and sunlight. By fall, they had 3 more horses. One rescued from a slaughterhouse auction, another from an overbred racing farm, and a third barely old enough to stand left tied to a tree on the outskirts of Silver Butte. Ghost, no, longer Shadow welcomed. Each one like a shepherd welcomes his flock. He didn't run anymore. He didn't need to. But every morning he stood tall at the edge of the corral, watching the sunrise with the stillness of something eternal. He'd become a teacher, a guardian, a living legend. The kids came slowly at first, shy, broken, one with a speech delay, another with bruises he swore came from falling. Ellie met each child with the same gentle strength her mother once showed Ghost. Luke taught them how to brush a horse without fear, how to listen with your palms, not just your ears, how to ride not for speed, but for connection. They didn't call it therapy. They didn't have to. The horses knew what to do. Word spread. By the next spring, Mustang Revival had a waiting list. Donations trickled in. An old cowboy from Texas sent 4 saddles. A retired vet in Colorado mailed hand-stitched blankets. Someone anonymously paid to fix the roof. Luke didn't chase the spotlight, but the town did. Newspapers came. Then a regional documentary crew. One headline read, "The Mustang they laughed at now leads the broken home." Gordon Munro watched it all from afar, until one evening, just past dusk, he walked up to the fence line. Ghost didn't shy away. Instead, the old stallion stepped forward and bowed his head. Gordon touched his nose. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And maybe that was enough. A year later, the barn was dressed in white ribbons and wildflowers. Ellie wore a dress passed down from her mother, lace-worn, but not faded. Luke stood beside Ghost, adjusting the red ribbon tied carefully around the horse's neck. It held 2 wedding rings. The ceremony was small. The whole town was invited, but only those who truly knew what this day meant showed up. Amos officiated. Martha cried. Ghost carried the rings down the aisle without missing a step. They said their vows beside the oak tree at the top of the hill, the same one Ghost once ran toward when his legs remembered love. Luke leaned in and whispered, "Thank you for staying." Ellie smiled. "I was talking to the horse." Ghost snorted softly, as if to say, "I knew." 20 years passed. The barn stood strong. The revival program grew beyond Ironwood Hollow. Other towns adopted the model. Some called it a movement. Luke never called it anything but home. Ellie ran the program. Luke trained the horses. And Ghost, now gray-white, like frost on sagebrush, lived in the pasture where the youngest foals played under his watchful eye. He walked slower, lay down more often, but his eyes stayed sharp. One crisp October morning, Luke, now silver-haired and slower, in step walked his granddaughter to the paddock. "His name's Ghost?" she asked. "Was," Luke replied. "Now we just call him Friend." The girl reached a hand through the fence. Ghost nuzzled it gently. "He's old." Luke smiled. "So am I." "Did he really win a race?" "No," Luke said. "He won me." The girl frowned. "That's not how races work." Luke chuckled. "It is when they matter." They sat together near the oak tree. Its branches stretched wider now, roots dug deep into the ground where Ghost once rediscovered his fire. At its base, a plaque glinted in the sun. "Here lies the horse they laughed at, but he made us all remember how to believe." Luke closed his eyes and leaned back against the tree. In the distance, a colt kicked up dust and galloped freely across the paddock. The wind picked up, carrying with it the soft echo of hooves and something older, something sacred, a whisper, a memory, a legend. Ghost was gone, but his story would never stop running. If this story moved something in you, drop a 1 in the comments. If it left you speechless, just type 0. Sometimes that's all it takes to show you were here, and you felt it too. And if you believe that even the forgotten deserve a second chance, subscribe now and ride with us into the next true animal story. There's always another soul waiting to be seen.